Hi, well, good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear me all right. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Ian Anderson. I'm the co-head of investments at Sygnia, and I'm going to be speaking to you this morning about the Sygnia Fourth Industrial Revolution Fund, a very exciting fund at Sygnia, a very relevant fund given the times that we're living through. But we're aware that it's a fund perhaps that people are not that familiar with. And so I'd like to spend some time this morning digging into the fund, looking at why we think it's important that people do have some exposure to the industries and the technologies that are in this fund, as well as to spend some time understanding how the fund is constructed. Because it is an index tracking fund, but it does not track the normal sort of market cap weighted indices that you might be familiar with. So an S&P 500 or FTSE JSE all-share index are market cap weighted indices, which means the largest companies have the most weight and are the most important in the index. These indices are constructed in such a way that they capture the forces and the economic forces that are driving the fourth industrial revolution that would not be captured in a normal market cap weighted index. So we'll spend some time digging into that in the presentation. Before we get going on it though, just a little bit of an advert for Sygnia. I know most of you will be familiar with who Sygnia are, but I think it's worth just highlighting a few of the things that we are passionate about at Sygnia. The first one is transparency around fees and costs. It's something we've always fully believed in, that in terms of empowering investors, it's very important to have a high level of transparency. And long before we were ever compelled to do so from a regulatory point of view, we've always disclosed the fees and costs to our investors. We think that's incredibly important. The second thing is disruption. Anyone who has any sort of knowledge of Sygnia, I think would be aware that we're not afraid of the disruptor tag. We are a relatively newcomer into the industry, so we're not afraid of disruption. We don't have any legacy systems or legacy products, so it allows us to disrupt the industry, and we think that's a good thing. And one of the ways that we do this is through technology, where we are a fintech company. So we fully believe in the use of technology to achieve this, as well as using technology to help drive fees down and costs down. And that brings me to the next slide, and apologies if you've seen any of our previous webinars, you would have seen this slide, but it's one that I feel extremely strongly about. So I'm going to go through it again. We do believe fees are one of the most important determinants of your long-term investment success. Management fees destroy value, and this is taken directly from a paper produced by National Treasury in 2013 entitled Charges in South African Retirement Funds. And I'm just going to read one of the conclusions. It says, a regular saver who reduces the charges on his or her retirement account from 2.5% of assets each year to 0.5% of assets annually would receive a benefit 60% greater at retirement after 40 years, all else being equal. So you'd get a benefit 60% greater at retirement by reducing fees by 2%. And management fees do not sound very big, 1% here, 2% there. And in a high return environment, that is not a big deal. When markets are returning 20, 25%, nobody's that concerned about a 1% or the difference between a 1% and a 2% management fee. But in the low return environment that we're certainly in at the moment, management fees suddenly become incredibly important. If you're only earning a 6, 7% return, inflation at 3 or 4%, a 2% management fee is taking away a big part of your real return. And controlling the fees that you pay is the one element of your investment strategy that you can control. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but you can control the fees that you do pay. And then the final conclusion in the sentence there is for someone who is a member of a preservation fund for 30 years, this increases to 80%. So that's someone who puts away a lump sum for 30 years. The difference can be up to 80%. And that's just by lowering fees. So we're incredibly passionate about low fees and empowering investors. So this morning, we're going to be speaking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution funds. These are global equity funds available in either a unit trust or an ETF. They track the S&P Kensho New Economies indices. So I'm going to spend some time going through that and who Kensho are, but that's incredibly important to understanding how these funds are constructed. And these funds aim to capture the drivers of future economic growth, put very simply. And we'll look at how they aim to achieve that. The funds were launched in September 2016, so we've got a 3.5-year track record that we're very proud of. We've got just over 2 billion Rand in assets in these funds. So they are amongst the fastest growing funds at Sygnia, so incredibly important to us. And importantly for you, the investor, they've achieved top performance. So we'll take a look at the performance as well. And these are high-risk funds. There's no doubt, nobody knows what the future is going to hold, but these are incredibly diversified funds as well. So we will take a look at that as we go along. So what is the fourth industrial revolution? I think it's best maybe just to go back and take a look at what the previous industrial revolutions were. The late 1700s, the first industrial revolution was the harnessing of steam. And that's essentially took us out of the fields and into factories. That was the first industrial revolution. And the second industrial revolution in the late 1800s, that was harnessing electricity, which led to mass production, which led to the internal combustion engine, to airplanes, to moving pictures. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about the second industrial revolution because it's one I think that we're perhaps most familiar with and most comfortable with. And I want to get across that there's a reason that they call these revolutions, because they are revolutionary in terms of economic growth, economic drivers, investing, in terms of finance, and in terms of the way people live their lives. And the example that I give here is at the turn of the century, the late 1800s, early 1900s, cities like London and New York were essentially powered by horses, horse-drawn buggies to move people around, horse-drawn carriages to move goods around the city. And in London, it's estimated there was upwards of 50,000 horses at the turn of the century working in the city. And in New York, it was upwards of 100,000 horses. And you can imagine horses being living, breathing, eating creatures. They produce a tremendous amount of waste every day. And in New York City, there was upwards of 2 million pounds of horse manure every day that was deposited on the streets of New York, and the same in London, which led to a massive problem. Obviously, it was an industry in itself, just removing this waste every day from the city, and ultimately they could not keep up. And it led to more and more problems. It led to disease. There was flies. The streets of London and New York were literally poisoning its citizens. To such an extent that at the turn of the century, they had an urban planning conference to deal specifically with this problem. And at the end of the conference, they could not come up with a solution. They did not know what to do about this horse problem that they had in the cities. And in fact, the only thing they came up with was the projection that in 10 years' time, every street in London would be covered in 9 feet of horse manure, which is obviously an incredibly untenable and unpleasant situation. And we know that didn't happen. And the solution did not come from any sort of planning or invention specifically set out to do this. It came about from the second industrial revolution, that harnessing of electricity, mass production, and a gentleman named Henry Ford and his invention of the Model T car, which I'll go through in some detail, but it led to a revolution where every person could ultimately afford their own car. And that ultimately in the 10-year period did away with the need for horses in the cities. So the Industrial Revolution, solving problems that did not seem to have solutions, revolutionizing economies and revolutionizing GDP output. But I want to just take a little look at the mass production of the Model T Ford. These are a number, I hope you can see them okay, postcards that were sent to me from my father that he found, and it illustrates what the Ford Motor Company plant looked like at the turn of the century. And this really epitomizes that second industrial revolution. This is the crankshaft department in the factory, 50 miles of belting running throughout the plant, automating the production of these cars, which is an incredible sight to see. This is the piston department, same thing, lots of machines, lots of camshafts, lots of belts. And then this is the output of one of the factories. So this is 1,000 Model T Fords, and very famously, you could get the Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black. But it was, even today, it ranks among the top 15 best-selling cars of all time. And one of the reasons that I want to speak a bit about it is it really drove that second industrial revolution. And today in the fourth industrial revolution that we'll get to, there's another car company that's very closely associated with the fourth IR, and that is Tesla. And it's interesting to note that Ford, with the Model T, they were producing upwards of 2 million of these cars a year. Ultimately, they sold over 15 million of these cars. And today, we have the top car manufacturer is Toyota. They produce over 10 million cars. The second is Volkswagen. They also produce 10 million cars. But in terms of valuation, Toyota is the most valuable company by market cap at 200 billion. Tesla is currently between 150 and 170 billion in market cap. In fact, it's greater than the sum of the next 3 car manufacturers, Volkswagen, Daimler, and General Motors combined. And at this point in the presentation, I know nobody's going to be able to answer me, but I'd like to say, is anyone aware of how many cars that Tesla produces in a year. So Toyota and VW are producing upwards of 10 million. Ford, over 100 years ago, was producing 2 million cars a day. And Tesla today is producing less than 400,000 cars a year. And this is not to say that we think either Tesla is a good buy or a bad buy or overvalued or undervalued company, but it's just to highlight that in these industrial revolutions that there's problems that are being solved, and we'll look at how Tesla is addressing this in a number of their ways, to problems that we didn't think had solutions. And it is revolutionizing what we're seeing in the market. But importantly, if these indices that we are tracking in this fund, in the fourth IR fund, if those were market cap weighted indices, Tesla would be a massive component of those indices and perhaps introducing a high element of risk. But as we'll see how these indices are constructed, Tesla is not that great. It's still a very important stock in the index, but it's nowhere near the effect it would have if it was a market cap weighted index. So that's a very important part of the construction of the funds. And then finally, that's the overall view of the Ford production plant. So I think that's a very interesting way to look at the second industrial revolution. The third industrial revolution in the 1960s is electronics, essentially the invention of the microprocessor, which led to the PC, which led to the internet. And we know how that has revolutionized automation, production, and consumers. It's been a fantastic revolution. And now we are at the fourth industrial revolution. And the way I like to describe that is it is the embedding of all of these technologies within our lives. So it's the merger of the physical, the digital, and the biological. And the way that I speak about that, because that does sound a bit pie in the sky, but I give a very real life example. A colleague of ours is a diabetic. And for diabetics, the most important thing obviously is controlling the blood sugar level. And it's not necessarily whether they're spiking up or spiking down, but it's to maintain it for good quality of life. It's to maintain your blood sugar level within an appropriate band. But obviously it's a very intrusive process. You have to prick your finger, analyze the blood, get the results, and that can take some time, and then take the appropriate steps. This company, which is a company that's in the Fourth Industrial Revolution Fund, and this is what our colleague now utilizes, he has a chip permanently embedded in his arm, and now to get his reading, he just needs to wave his smartphone underneath his arm, and immediately he gets a readout on his phone. And very importantly, the readout will show him what his current blood sugar level is. It'll show him what it has been for the past 24 hours, the last 48 hours, so he can get a sense of how he's managing it. And it has revolutionized his life. It's made his life far easier. And importantly, obviously when diabetics are asleep, things can happen to their blood sugar levels that they're not aware of. It can be quite dangerous. This chip can now send a message if the blood sugar level drops while he's sleeping, sends a message to his phone, sets off an alarm and wakes him up, and he can take the action. So again, a very, very small but very concrete sort of example of how these technologies are impacting our lives and are getting embedded in our lives. So what are some of the technologies that are driving the fourth industrial revolution? And we'll go into these in some detail, but it's artificial intelligence, AI, robotics, autonomous vehicles, 3D printing, nanotechnology, biotechnology. There's 22 subsectors in total, which we'll look at, but it really is driving a massive revolution in how people are going to be investing into the future, how industries are going to work in the future, and it's going to be exponential. Really. That is the key takeaway from this, and this fund gives you a way to invest in those companies that are going to benefit from these trends. And before we get into the index, then just to take a look, these are the most valuable companies listed in the S&P 500. Just 15 years ago, the index itself was dominated by energy companies and conglomerates and financial firms. There was only one technology company. 15 years later, we have 4 trillion, essentially $1 trillion companies. They are all tech companies. And it's not something we could have anticipated necessarily 15 years ago, but going forward, we do know that there's going to be companies that we're not aware of today that are going to be dominating the market's going to be dominating finance, and we need to find a way to invest in those. But importantly, if we just invested in that market cap weighted index, we'd have exposure to these very large companies. You're not necessarily going to get exposure to the smaller companies that are really at the forefront of these new technologies and new industries, and that is what our fund is investing in. So how did we come across these indices? How are they created? Well, they are called the S&P Kensho New Economy Indices, and they have these 21st century sectors. Kensho itself is a company that was founded in 2013 by a chap named Daniel Nadler, and it was funded by Google Ventures, Goldman Sachs, and CNBC. And the intention at the time was to utilize these new technologies, big data, artificial intelligence, to analyze data in the markets and to come up with analysis that could not be done previously. And essentially, they brought in all of the data that's out there in the market, including the traditional things like financial statements, SEC filings, company reports, those kinds of things. But then they also brought in social media posts, news stories, satellite imagery to construct a massive data warehouse that could then be interrogated with their algorithms using the big data, using the artificial intelligence to come up with answers. So they could ask things like, what are the top performing sectors in the 12 months following a conflict in the Middle East? And this algorithm could go in, look at the data, and come up with answers for you to help you invest. Or you could ask it questions like, what happens to banking stocks in the US if there's a manufacturing depression in Germany? You could get those sorts of answers. And the people at Kensho very quickly realized that they're getting these wonderful answers, but there was not a real way for people to measure it or to invest in it, because the factors and the forces that they were seeing with this technology in the fourth industrial revolution was not being captured by normal market indices. So they decided to launch their own set of market indices. They identified 22 sectors, and then using their algorithms, using their machine that they were getting this market analysis from, they could identify companies that had exposure to these different sectors and these different technologies that they thought was going to be driving the fourth industrial revolution. And we'll take a look at how that has worked. But they launched these indices in 2016, late August. And I won't forget it because our founder and CEO, Magda Wierzycka, the day the press release came out, she called me into her office. I think it was a Monday afternoon, and she said, we are launching a fund that is going to track these indices. And by the following Monday, Magda was in New York meeting with Daniel and the team to sign the deal, get an understanding of the company. A week after that, I sent our head of indexation to New York and Boston to meet with the engineers and the designers of the algorithm to get an understanding. And less than 4 weeks later, at the beginning of October, we had launched the fund. So it happened very fast, and I think it combines all the things that we spoke about in terms of the passion of Sygnia, from technology, disruption, low fees. It all came together very wonderfully in this fund. And we'll take a look at how it has performed, but we are very pleased with this fund. So Kensho constructs these indices, and to this day, we are the largest manager of funds that are tracking these Kensho indices. So we've got a very close relationship with them, and it's something we are very pleased with. So if we take a look at what some of the subsectors are then that make up the fund, that make up the index, and these are the technologies that is driving the fourth industrial revolution: the space index, drones, autonomous vehicles, cybersecurity, robotics, wearable index. And we'll go through some of these to take a look at examples and how they are working and what sort of companies are there. Clean tech, a very important component of the index, clean energy, smart grids, smart borders. So these are the sectors that they have identified, and using their algorithm, they find companies that have exposure to these technologies, exposure to these industries, and it's not done in the traditional way. So in the past, perhaps the only way that people could look at it was to say, well, what portion of Apple's revenue or is actually associated with clean energy? Do they have any that's associated with that? Or what portion of their revenue, a company's revenue? Kensho is able to dig deep into this data that they have in order to look at the entire ecosystem of these different industries to find what companies are going to benefit from it, what companies are involved in it currently. And then they construct their indices, and then we track those indices within the fund. So just taking a look individually at some of the sectors, so revolutionizing the interaction with space. This is the space index, and it may sound very pie in the sky, but we know with the recent launch of SpaceX to launching humans up to the International Space Station, things are progressing very quickly. There is human space flight, there's deep space for rare earth mineral extraction. That's a very important part, obviously, with our technologies, our cell phones. These minerals are very difficult to find on Earth, but they are in abundance in space. And they say within the next 10 years, we are going to be mining these things from space in order to help us out here on Earth. And the important thing here that I like to look at is I've just listed some of the constituents of this index. Is that it's companies that you would be familiar with. So again, it's companies like a Boeing, like a Lockheed Martin, but it's not one you would necessarily associate with space. and these types of technologies and industries. But using the algorithms from Kensho, they can determine how much of a company like Boeing is associated with space exploration, and they're able to include them in the index. But then there's plenty of companies that perhaps you would not have heard of, and these are the smaller companies or less well-known companies, like an Aerojet Rocketdyne, an Amphenol, or Mercury Systems that make up this particular index. And it's important to note that a company can feature in more than one index. We have companies that do feature in upwards of 4 indices, but we'll take a look at that as we go along. One that I really love to talk about is 3D printing, revolutionizing clothing and supply chain. Clothing is one very small part of it, obviously, but currently they're 3D printing houses. But it really is revolutionizing the supply chain, where no longer did something have to be produced, then passed on for beneficiation to somebody else, and passed on until it gets to the consumer. Now things can be 3D printed right at the final point of sale. And I like to highlight these shirts that are 3D printed with these brand new materials that are breathable, that control the temperature, they regulate your body heat, they don't wrinkle, they don't come untucked. So again, these types of companies that are manufacturing these are companies that feature in the Fourth Industrial Revolution Fund. And it's not just things like clothing and houses that are being 3D printed, but very importantly, things like human tissue are being 3D printed now. They can 3D print replacement ears for burn victims, and they're starting to work on 3D printing organs as well. It's going to revolutionize medicine going forward. So that's a very exciting component of the fund. And again, you take a look at the companies that are involved in the 3D printing. Some like HP you'll be familiar with, but other ones you're possibly not going to be familiar with. But again, the algorithm, the big data analysis, the artificial intelligence is finding those companies that are associated with the subsector 3D printing. Then revolutionizing transportation, this is Tesla, although Tesla features in a number of different indices, but they really are changing the world with their autonomous electric vehicle. And it's not just fully autonomous vehicles that's being revolutionized here, but it's the idea of connected cars. And I think most of us today, perhaps the cars that we're driving now do have many of these features already in the car. So they may not be able to drive themselves down the road, but they can certainly assist you with parking, they can assist you with lane changing, and that is going to radically change the way we interact with cars, the way we interact with cities in the next 10, 15, 20 years, as well as revolutionizing how deliveries happen. So you think back to the beginning of the 19th century with the horse problem, you know, now we're taking it even one step further. The vehicle solved that problem for us now, but autonomous vehicles can also solve the problem of congestion, traffic congestion that we are dealing with. And again, some names you're going to be familiar with, other companies that you're not going to be so familiar with. Revolutionizing gaming, surgery, and communication. So this is virtual technology. And so obviously it's very easy to understand how this can impact gaming, which is a very big market. But this virtual reality is also revolutionizing surgery. And you think in the past, if someone was having surgery done on the brain, the surgeon really only had one shot to go in. They could perhaps take an MRI or get some imagery to understand what is going on if there's a tumor in the brain, but that they could not do much more than that before going in. But now it is possible to generate a 3D model of a person's brain. Perhaps it's a tumor that needs to be removed in that brain. Surgeons can generate a 3D model of that brain, and then using virtual reality, they can practice the surgery before they have to do it. So they can find out what is the best way to go through the brain to get to that tumor to optimize the chances of success. So that is revolutionizing surgery, and that is happening right now. Never mind the fact that a surgeon can be sitting in one city and the patient in another city, that can also happen. But the fact that they're able to practice surgeries is just revolutionary. And again, the Fourth Industrial Revolution Fund is finding and investing in those companies that are exposed to this sorts of technology. In terms of sustainability, this is a very important factor right now in terms of clean energy, and we'll speak a bit about this, but ESG, it's becoming an incredibly important factor for investors, for trustees of pension funds, and there is clean energy subsector in this fund, and obviously that's a massive driving factor going forward. Countries like Germany and Portugal have full days where they are using renewable energy, and it's not just wind and sun, and obviously very importantly, the cost of solar energy is coming down. From the production of the solar panels is coming down at an exponential pace, which is fantastic, but it's also harnessing the energy of the earth using biothermal technologies, and this is a big factor, and obviously a very, very important factor to the sustainability of the planet and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Revolutionizing finance in terms of robo-advisors, not just robo-advisors, and we do not believe, and we speak a lot about this at Sygnia, that robo-advisors are ever fully going to replace the need for financial advice. We do believe that that is always going to be in place, but they are revolutionizing the way people go about managing their investments. That we do know that, and if you look at the companies that are invested in here, these are big asset management companies globally that have a large fleet of independent financial advisors, but they also offer robo-advice because it leads people into going and seeking the advice from a real person, but it allows them to do their own modeling and their own work ahead of time, and then going in to speak to somebody. And again, that's using technology. It does bring down costs, and that's a very exciting part of the market. And again, something that this fund is going to be exposed to. And again, firms that you're familiar with, Bank of Montreal, BlackRock, Charles Schwab, and then other ones like On Deck Capital and Kidian that you would not be so familiar with. So taking a look at the fund itself, we'll then we'll look at the performance of the fund, but really just to show that this is a very diversified fund. This is not a highly concentrated fund. There's over 380 individual constituents that comprise these 22 subsector indices. And we just show the top 10 here, really just to show that there's not an over concentration to any one particular stock. Tesla is the #1 holding, but again, if this was a market cap weighted index, Tesla would be a much bigger weighting, 20–25% weighting in the index. It is at 3%, just less than 3% at the moment. But it also lets you see the 12-month returns, and we'll take a look at the performance, but there's been some fantastic returns from very interesting parts, very interesting subsectors of these indices. And again, a lot of names that you would be familiar with, and NVIDIA, Tesla, Apple, Garmin, but then many companies that perhaps you wouldn't be that familiar with. And it does show you that these companies are not just in one index, but they are in upwards of 4 indices, and using this proprietary Kensho methodology to construct these indices, that is the fund that is the index that this fund is tracking. So very importantly, it's one thing to speak all nicely about these pie-in-the-sky technologies and things, but how has it performed? Again, we have a 3.5-year track record. So on this graph, I know there's a lot of bars and names and things, but the things to focus on are the dark red lines. That is the Sygnia Fourth Industrial Revolution Fund itself. And I just put in the MSCI World Index for comparison. And this is in the ACISA Global Equity category, performance over 1 year to the end of May. And you can see how well, in fact, the Fourth IR fund is the 7th best performing fund. The light pink bars are other Sygnia funds that we happen to have in the category. So it's very nice to see that our FANG fund that invests in the Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, and Netflix type fund, a very high risk, high concentrated fund, but it has done extremely well. And it's nice to see. So obviously we know that, and given the market that we've had and everything, these technology companies, these large technology companies have really driven markets. Hence, we see something like the FANG fund being up at the top, but it's very pleasing to see something like the Fourth Industrial Revolution Fund with 380 companies in it, not an over concentration of those FANG stocks, still performing extremely well, producing returns upwards of 40% over the last year in Rand for investors. Obviously, the Rand appreciated 20%, added 20% to that return, but generating a very nice return nonetheless. That's over 1 year. Over 3 years, it's a similar story, 7th best performing fund against the MSCI index, and holding up obviously extremely well against other actively managed funds, more expensive funds in the category. And then the since inception return, in fact, it is the 3rd best performing fund since inception in the category. And we're incredibly pleased about that. And the investors who believed in us from the beginning have obviously done extremely well out of an investment in this fund. And finally, just to take a look at how this performance has been achieved. Again, very diversified fund, 380 stocks, 22 different subsectors. So it's very interesting to see how these subsectors have performed. The light green bar in the middle there is the Kensho Composite Index. That's the index that we are tracking in the fund. But you can see how the other indices have performed. And very interestingly, the top performing index over the last year is the Kensho Enterprise Collaboration Index. And in hindsight, that's something that's fantastic that we had exposure to. And obviously that relates to how enterprises are getting people to work together in new ways. So the very fact that we're sitting doing this webinar now using something like Zoom, we're probably all looking at it on different devices. Maybe some people are on tablets, some are on smartphones, some are using Apple, some are using Microsoft, but we're all able to be connected. That's something that was not available 15 years ago. And that Enterprise Collaboration Index invests in companies that are benefiting from these types of technologies. So things like Microsoft, that is how Microsoft features, but other things like Slack and Jira that are benefiting from this. And a year ago, you probably wouldn't have gone excited about seeing a Kensho Enterprise Collaboration Index. But given what we've been living through with the COVID-19 global pandemic, it's very nice to see that there is subsectors that are benefiting from what we are seeing in the market. And that is the way this diversification of this fund works. So it diversifies away the risk. It is still a high risk fund. It's investing in future technologies that may or may not be proven, but it is finding those technologies that's driving the economic growth in very difficult market conditions. So again, these slides will be available so you can look through it at your leisure, but it's very interesting to see the performance of many of these indices. So I've kind of been racing along, but I'll take some questions. But just in conclusion, we very firmly believe that these new economies, these subsector indices are going to be the technologies of the future. The effect is going to be exponential. Again, they don't call them industrial revolutions for nothing. They do revolutionize economies. They revolutionize finance and investing. And we firmly believe that these the Kensho methodology of constructing these indices is capturing the forces that are going to be changing the world through these new technologies, the new indices, in ways that market cap weighted indices simply could not do. We still obviously very firmly believe in market cap weighted indices, especially in a country like South Africa that doesn't have a very diversified stock market. But having this from an international point of view, we think the construction of these indices certainly warrants then anybody who has a long-term investment strategy needs to have some exposure to these types of economies. They offer a strong diversification away from the traditional manufacturing orientated industries. And there is a massive amount of investment going on globally by large companies, venture capital firms into this part of the market. And this fund gives South African investors a fantastic way to benefit from that. And finally, you know, there's the two types of people that are going to make money from this types of rapid change that we see, and that's the inventors, that's the very clever people, very smart people, but then it's also going to be people more like myself that are the investors and the allocators of capital that you can get exposure to it. And certainly from my children's point of view, I think it's fantastic that they've got exposure to this type of fund, very long-term investment horizon. And we do believe, again, it warrants an inclusion in any sort of investment strategy. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope I didn't go through it all too quickly. I guess the one thing that we have seen is I didn't understand how autonomous vehicles would assist with traffic congestion. Please explain again. Well, that's just very simply, and it needs to be proven, but they say in cities, large cities like Cape Town, like Johannesburg, New York, London, that the biggest cause of traffic congestion is actually people looking for parking. That it's people slowing down, driving through a city, looking for parking, looking for a place to park. With autonomous vehicles, they can certainly take themselves far away. That's one solution to the traffic congestion. But the other way that they do envision, and it's a long way down the road, but in terms of the interconnectedness of cars, it's not just an autonomous vehicle tracking the cars around them and moving through, it's cars that are speaking to the other cars. And they do envision a time where traffic moves through cities like your blood vessels move through your veins. So at a traffic intersection right now, cars have to come to a stop so traffic can go one way. If the cars are speaking to each other, the cars from one direction can merge with cars going the other direction and not collide and actually not need to slow down. So very simply, that is how autonomous vehicles can help with traffic congestion. The next one is on clean tech exposure, how much clean tech is in the fund. This is a question we got beforehand. Currently, there's 15% roughly of the fund that's invested in companies that are exposed to clean technology and clean energy. And again, it's exposed to it. So it's not that they're fully involved in clean energy, but they have exposure to it. So again, it could be something like Tesla, which gets included in the clean energy index, but they're also in the autonomous vehicle index, but this 15% of the fund is invested in companies that are involved in clean energy. And then the final one I think that I'll take is in terms of the fees. Sorry, that is a very important aspect of it. We have two different vehicles that you can invest in, and there's two different fee structures. So on the ETF that's listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, it has a TER of just under 60 basis points, so 0.6%. That is the fee. The unit trust has a slightly different vehicle that it invests in, and it has a TER of 93 basis points for the one class and 85 basis points for the other class. So one has a performance fee, one doesn't have a performance fee. And the reason that those fees are higher is that it is a different vehicle, so there's a different constraints within that fund, but it also, because it's a different vehicle, it's a unit trust, it allows us to invest not just in the Kensho indices, but allows us to invest in things like our very exciting Oxford Sciences Innovation Fund, our ESG fund, which Magda has given webinars on before. So the fourth IR unit trust has a 5% exposure, and again, that's what accounts for the higher fee in that fund. I guess one more question has just come in. Would you consider this fund for retirees? Certainly, I'm not in a position to give any sort of financial advice, but again, we do believe looking forward, it does warrant having some exposure. It is a high-risk fund. You can't get away from that, but it is a diversified fund. So I think speak to a financial advisor. You could work out what would be appropriate, but it's also, you can think of it as a hedge, certainly for somebody who's maybe approaching retirement or even in retirement. It's a hedge against what's going to be happening in the future. You know, things are going to be disrupted, things are going to be replaced. Trying to invest in those companies that's causing the disruption is a way to hedge your investment portfolio against that. But thank you very much. I'm just checking the time. I think that's 30 minutes. That's about the limit that I think people are willing to listen to. So thank you very much for joining me this morning. And if I didn't get your questions, we've got them. We've got your details. We'll certainly answer them individually. And if you've got any more questions, please feel free to send them through to us, and we'll do our best to answer them. But thank you very much.